In May of 2020, it will have been 174 years since the tragedy of the Donner Party. Over the years, there's been countless retellings of the Donner Party's horrific journey. I was first introduced to the story of the Donner Party through the movie The Shining. On the car ride up to the hotel with his family, Jack Nicholson is telling them about the Donner Party and how they had to resort to cannibalism. I had never heard of the Donner Party before, but I did know what cannibalism was. So after watching The Shining, I went upstairs and opened up an encyclopedia and searched for the Donner Party. There was about 3 paragraphs that basically said who they were, that they left too late, they didn't bring enough food, and they got stuck in the Sierra Nevadas in the wintertime and ended up having to eat each other. And that was about all I ever knew about the Donner Party for most of my life. Now, some of you may recall we had a My Haunted House episode on this channel called The Feast. Unfortunately, we got a takedown notice and that video had to go. I really liked that episode. It talks about 3 women renting a cab on Donner Lake, not knowing that Donner Pass had some tragic history. And during the evening, they're terrorized by the ghosts of the Donner Party. By far the best documentary about the Donner Party was created by Rick Burns in 1992. It's a fantastic documentary worth watching.
The picture of distress was shocking indeed. They had consumed 2 children of Jacob Donner. Mrs. Graves' body was lying there, with almost all the flesh cut away from her arms and limbs. Her breasts were cut off, and her heart and liver taken out. Her little child, about 13 months old, sat at her side, one arm upon the body of its mangled mother, sobbing bitterly, cried, "Ma, Ma, Ma."
A few weeks ago, I wanted to know more about the events leading up to the Donner Party being stranded in the Sierra Nevadas. Up until that point, I really wasn't aware of the details, and I just figured that they left too late, didn't bring enough food, and that was that. Little did I know there was a lot of information out there, some more accurate than others. I did some fact-checking as best I could and put together a rough timeline of the events for the Donner Party when they left Springfield, Illinois, up until the foot of the Sierra Nevadas. The Donner Party's story begins April 15, 1846, in Springfield, Illinois. George Donner, Jacob Donner, and James Fraser Reed, along with their families, have 3 covered wagons apiece. Each has hired teamsters to drive the oxen that pull them. James and Margaret Reed are a respected family from Springfield, Illinois. James originally wanted to go to Oregon, but changed his mind and settled on California, hoping that the weather would help Margaret's headaches. George Donner was a prosperous farmer from Springfield, Illinois that sold his land seeking better opportunities in the West. The 3 families with their 9 wagons would travel to Independence, Missouri, where the Oregon Trail begins. On May 10, 1846, the Donners and Reeds arrive at Independence, Missouri, where they spend the next 2 days completing their outfits for their journey. At this time, Independence had been outfitting wagon trains for the travels on the Oregon and Santa Fe trails since 1821. As early as 1843, Oregon Trail wagon trains leaving Independence could reach sizes of 120 wagons, nearly 1,000 people, and thousands of livestock. As the Donner Party's 9 wagons left Independence, nearly 500 wagons had already left headed west ahead of them. After gathering supplies, the Donner Party's 9 wagons would leave Independence 2 days later. On May 27th, they reached the east bank of the Big Blue River in Kansas. Unfortunately, the water is so high they're forced to build rafts to carry their wagons across. This will take them the next 4 days to accomplish. Up until this point, their journey's been relatively uneventful. Unfortunately, Mrs. Reed's mother, Sarah Keyes, dies of tuberculosis and is buried under a tree near Alcove Spring. The week prior to reaching the Blue River, the Donner wagon train had caught up with the larger wagon train of Colonel William Henry Russell and decided to join this larger group for the rest of their journey. On June 7th, the party would cross into what is currently Nebraska. Tamsen Donner would notice that the land was very fertile, perfect for cultivation. For several years, the wagon trains leaving Independence would meet up with the wagon trains headed westward from Council Bluffs, Iowa. Since the hundreds of wagons leaving Independence ahead of them had followed the same path, they were lucky enough to find a smooth road for the rest of the way to the Platte River. Just after 2 months since leaving Springfield, Illinois, the Donner Party reaches the Platte River. The pioneers used 3-island crossing to get to the other side of the Platte River. This is where the trail leaving Independence, Missouri intersects with the trail leaving from Council Bluffs, Iowa. Just 3 months later, the U.S. government would select this site to build Fort Kearny. For the next 30 years, Fort Kearny would provide supplies and protection to future pioneers. After traveling along the North Platte River, they reach Ash Hollow, the first dry land crossing they would encounter. Up until this point, they've been traveling along rivers or across rivers. At this point, most pioneers will be using landmarks to guide them to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, such as the Chimney Rock or the Courthouse and Jail Rocks. Robert Stewart, an explorer, first recorded Courthouse and Jailhouse Rock in 1812. These pair of rock formations served as a welcome landmark along the trails for many pioneers traveling west in the 19th century. The Oregon-California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Pony Express Trail, and the Sydney Deadwood Trail all ran near these rocks. June 27, 1846, the wagon train reaches Fort Laramie, Wyoming. At the time, it had been known as Fort John and was not an official U.S. Army outpost. James Reed of the Donner Party meets James Clyman, an old mountaineer, who says he's just come from California with Lansford Hastings via a new route, a route purportedly to shave time off the travel. When James Reed indicates to James Clyman that he's interested in taking this new route, soon to be known as Hastings Cutoff, Clyman urges him to avoid Hastings Cutoff and take the regular route instead. It's at this point that a fateful decision is made. James Reed indicates in his journal that he will urge the party to take Hastings Cutoff. The wagon train would stay at Fort John until July 4th and leave the following morning. As the party approaches Independence Rock on July 17th, they encounter a lone eastbound rider bearing an open letter from Hastings urging all immigrants now on the road to meet him at Fort Bridger so he can guide them to his cutoff. Independence Rock got its name from the goal of reaching that location by July 4th, which meant you were making a timely journey across the open plains. It's important to note that several members of the Donner Party had left just prior to reaching Fort Laramie. William Russell and Edwin Bryant would have already met Hastings at this point. They had traded in their wagons for mules so they could travel much more quickly. And in fact, they would be the first ones to cross the Sierra Nevada ahead of the Donner Party. As the Donner Party reaches Little Sandy Crossing, the decision is made to carry on to Fort Bridger. Some of the members of the wagon train decide to take the traditional route to Fort Hall. George Donner's wife, Tamsen Donner, expresses misgivings about this new route. She feels as though it's too good to be true. The Hastings Cutoff is advertised to shave 300 miles off the trip, but in actuality it adds over 100 miles through very harsh terrain and extremely dry, dangerous deserts. Difficulties have begun to manifest for the Donner Party. The trip from Independence to Fort Bridger would result in numerous livestock being killed from bad water. On July 27th, the Donner Party arrives at Fort Bridger, which consists of 2 cabins and a corral owned by mountaineer Jim Bridger. The Donner Party learns that Hastings left a week ago, leading the wagons of the Harlan Young Party through the Hastings Pass. Prior to taking the Harlan Young Party through the pass, Hastings had already left the Bryant-Russell Party, which was previously a member of the Donner Party, before leaving on their mules. Although initially concerned, George and Jacob Donner, along with James Reed, are reassured after reading the letter that Hastings has left behind. In his journal, James Reed writes, Hastings Cutoff is said to be a saving of 350 or 400 miles and a better route. The rest of the Californians went the long route, feeling afraid of Hastings Cutoff. But Mr. Bridger informs me that it is a fine level road with plenty of water and grass. It is estimated that 700 miles will take us to Captain Sutter's Fort, which we hope to make in 7 weeks from this day. It's at this point that it's clear that more than just the elements and time are working against the Donner Party. The motivations of individuals have come into play. Jim Bridger stating that the road is flat and level and there's plenty of water and grass is obviously a gross exaggeration of what they're about to experience. Initially, the Donner Party makes good time, following the tracks of the group ahead of them that's being led by Hastings. However, as the Donner Party stops near the mouth of Echo Canyon, they see a note left for them by Hastings. It warns them that the road ahead is impassable and instructing them to send someone ahead to get instructions. James Reed and 2 others set out following the wagon tracks of the Hastings group. Now this is where it gets confusing. Hastings will eventually lead 3 parties through the Hastings Cutoff, but there's 3 different routes that he has chosen. The Donner Party would be the last of his groups to go through the Hastings Cutoff. The first was the Bryant Russell Party, which was initially part of the Donner Party. They were the ones that sold their mules at Fort Laramie so they could be much quicker. They met Hastings and Hastings led them through a different pass further north. The second group that Hastings would lead through the Wasatch Mountains along Hastings Cutoff was the Harlan Young Party, but that party consisted of wagons, and he knew that the pass that the mules took would not work. He intended to take them through the area that the Donners would be going through, but Hastings had a partner, James Hudspeth, and he met the Harlan Young Party and took them through the place where the Bryant Russell Party went through. Unfortunately, as the path they were on narrowed, the wagons were no longer able to make it, so they had to double back and cut through 6 days worth of growth to take a new trail that no one had ever taken before. To avoid this problem with the Donner Party, which had a far larger amount of oxen and wagons, they were going to go further south still and come out just south of the Salt Lake. Unfortunately, no wagon train had ever gone through this area before. So he left a note at the base of the trail for one of the Donner Party members to come find him, and he would point out what he felt was the best route. Unfortunately for the Donner Party, this route would add weeks onto their delays. The truth of the matter is Hastings was improvising on Fremont's party's success. Fremont's party had led a group across the Great Salt Lake and the desert following it. Hastings' first time leading a group through the Wasatch Mountains was the Bryant Russell Mule Party. But since they had no wagons, he had no idea how difficult it was going to be for the following Harlan Young Party. When he realized the Harlan Young Party wasn't going to be very happy with the 6 days of hard labor, he figured he could push the Donners further south. Little did he know this would make things miserable for the Donner Party, and eventually doom them to their fate. Tragically for the Donner Party, the travel through the Wasatch Mountains was just the beginning of all of the suffering they would be going through. The Wasatch Mountains took 16 days to hack out a 36-mile road. They spent time resting around Salt Lake to gather water and supplies. Lansford Hastings had stated that the Great Salt Desert was only 2 days across and 40 miles. It actually ended up being 5 days travel and 80 miles. By the time they reached Pilot Peak on September 8th, the immigrants were fighting amongst themselves. They'd lost 36 head of cattle and numerous other animals, and spent a week recovering from the ordeal. After taking stock of their inventory, by September 10th they realized they didn't have enough food to make it to Sutter's Fort, so they sent Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon ahead to get more food. On October 5th, while struggling up a sandy hill at Iron Point, Nevada, the Reed and Graves teams become entangled. A fight breaks out between Milt Elliott, Reed's teamster, and John Snyder driving the Graves wagon. When Reed intervenes with his knife to cut the teams apart, Snyder grows angrier and hits Reed on the head with the whip handle. As Snyder's about to strike Reed again, he accidentally hits Mrs. Reed. This angers Mr. Reed to the point of stabbing Mr. Snyder in the chest with his hunting knife. Snyder stumbles some feet up the hill and dies. Lewis Keseberg once suggested that they should hang Reed for that act, but the immigrants decide to banish Reed with no food or weaponry. Reed's daughter-in-law would later sneak him a rifle and some food along the trail. While traveling along the Humboldt River, a sense of urgency takes hold of the entire group. Some of the wagons begin to take off ahead on their own. Other wagons begin to cast out some of the members, forcing them to walk. In one case, an elderly Belgian man was forced to walk. When he could no longer walk, he was left behind. The last time anyone saw him, he was sitting on the road by himself. At night, the Paiute Indians killed 21 of the Donner Party's oxen. As the party begins to spread out, the Indians take advantage of this, killing another 18 oxen the next day. More than 100 of the party's cattle are now gone. This will seal their fate in the Sierra Nevadas. On October 13th, since the Indians have killed almost all his cattle, a German immigrant named Wolfinger stops at the Humboldt sink to cache his wagon. Two men, Joseph Reinhardt and Augustus Spitzer, stay behind to help him, but return without him, saying that he has been killed by Indians. Later, while dying, Reinhardt will confess to killing Wolfinger. Finally, on October 16th, the Donner Party arrives at the Truckee River, which will lead them into the Sierra Nevada. John Breen later recalled of this day, "The weather was already very cold, and the heavy clouds hanging over the mountains to the west were strong indications of an approaching winter. Some wanted to stop and rest their cattle. Others, in fear of the snow, were favoring of pushing ahead as fast as possible." The last ray of hope before a long, dark, horrific struggle would come on October 25th, when Chris Stanton returned from Sutter's Fort. He brought 7 mules loaded with provisions and 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, plus news that the pass through the Sierras would be open for another month. Tragically for the Donner Party, the snows would come much sooner, and the pass would indeed be blocked by upwards of 20 feet of snow. Heroic efforts would be made to rescue them, from both the camps in the nearby area and from the party themselves. But horrific events of cannibalism would take place. This tragedy would become a lesson to others. Pack enough food, stay on the trail, and don't waste time. The documentary that follows is a detailed account of the events that took place in the Sierra Nevada. It's a testament to human suffering and the will to survive.
The Donner Party reaches the Truckee Meadow near present-day Reno, Nevada, and sets up camp. While camped, William Pike and William Foster make plans to go ahead and get supplies for the group. While William Foster is handling a 6-shooter, the gun goes off and shoots Pike in the back. He's mortally wounded. He dies a short time later. The weather is getting colder, and some in the group start up the Truckee River while the others stay at the camp. Charles Stanton finally returns with supplies and with news that James Reed has made it to California. With Stanton are 2 Miwok Indians, Lewis and Salvador. Unable to return with Stanton is McCutcheon, who is ill from the journey to Sutter's Fort. He stays back at the fort to recuperate. The Donner Party reaches present-day California and heads for the pass. While moving up the valley, an Indian shot 19 of the group's oxen with arrows. As the Indian fled, William Eddy fires his gun, striking the Indian in the back and killing him. In California, James Reed and the now recovered William McCutcheon get supplies from Sutter's Fort and head east to meet the Donner Party. The Donner Party pushes for the summit as snow begins to fall. George Donner and his family stop at Alder Creek after he injures his hand repairing a broken wagon axle. The rest of the group moves past present-day Donner Lake towards the summit. The snow is too deep for the wagons and is getting deeper with every step they take. Soon they can no longer find the trail. They return to a small cabin used by the Stevens Party in 1844 and begin to set up a camp. The Donners are approximately 6 miles to the east at Alder Creek, building tents to shelter them from the storm. The storm continues to cover the area with a deep blanket of snow. The group at the lake attempts another crossing of the pass the next day. The Donner family remains at Alder Creek. A storm is brewing and everyone moves as fast as they can through the snow. Not 2 miles from the camp, the snow becomes too deep for the wagons. They pack their belongings on their oxen and the mules that had brought them supplies back with Stanton. Each step, the snow is getting deeper and deeper. Soon it is chest high. The animals are struggling to maintain their footing. Exhaustion is setting in with members of the group. The group stops and lights a fire. Most drift off to sleep.
We, the women, were all so tired carrying the children that they could not go over that night. So we made a fire and got something to eat, and Ma spread down a buffalo robe. And we all laid down on it and spread something over us. And it snowed 1 foot on top of the bed. Virginia Reed.
The group is covered in a thick blanket of snow during the night. In the morning, it is obvious that they will not be able to cross the summit.
So we got up in the morning, and the snow was so deep we could not go over, and we had to go back to the cabin and build more cabins and stay there all winter without Pa. Virginia Reed.
The group returns to the cabin near the lake. They begin to build 2 more for the other families. The Donner families and a few others remain at Alder Creek. James Reed and William McCutcheon are forced to turn back to Sutter Fort. The severe snowstorm has blocked their route into the mountains. At the cabins, most families have killed the remaining oxen and cows. Their hides have been used to cover the tops of the cabins. The meat is kept in the snow, frozen for later use. The Donner Party prepares to wait out the storm and then make another attempt over the pass in the coming days. At Sutter Fort, James Reed is informed that most able-bodied men are now fighting in the Mexican War. A rescue attempt will have to wait. Reed and Sutter estimate that the Donner Party should have enough meat to survive in the mountains. Unknown to both of them is the hardship the group has suffered since Reed was banished. They are already running dangerously low on food. On November 20th, Patrick Breen begins a diary of the events that are happening at the lake cabins.
Friday, November 20th, 1846. Came to this place on the 31st of last month. The remainder of time, up to this day, was clear and pleasant, freezing at night, the snow nearly gone from the valleys. Patrick Breen.
At the lake cabins, another attempt is made to cross the summit. The weather is clear, and a group of about 20 start for the pass. The snow is incredibly deep as they near the summit, but all push forward. The group crosses the summit only to find that the snow is so deep that they cannot continue. After 2 days, they are forced back to the lake cabins. It begins to snow. The snow continues to fall. It snows for days without stopping. Many remain inside their cabins too weak to do anything. Food is already in very short supply. Charles Stanton and Franklin Ward Graves begin to make snowshoes for another attempt over the mountain summit. On December 15th, Bayless Williams dies at the lake camps. On December 16th, the weather clears and a group of snowshoers heads for the summit. Estimating it will only take them 10 days to get to safety, the group takes little food, leaving most with those still at the camp. The snowshoe party includes 10 men, 5 women, and 2 children. Without snowshoes, Charlie Berger and 10-year-old William Murphy turn back after the first day. They return to the lake cabins. The other 15 continue their journey. They will later become known as the Forlorn Hope. They are weak with hunger, and the climb to the summit has exhausted all of them. They have few provisions and are becoming weaker with every step they take. At the lake camp, it has become a struggle for some just to get out of their cabins. The starvation and exposure to the freezing cold is starting to take its toll on the group. Ox hides are boiled to make a meal of thick soup. These tough hides are almost unbearable to consume. On December 21st, Milt Elliott returns to the lake cabins from the Donner camp at Alder Creek. He informs the group that things are bad for the Donners and the others at that camp. Jacob Donner, Samuel Shoemaker, James Smith, and Joseph Reinhardt have all died. The snowshoe party struggles forward. They have been on the move for 6 days. They are now completely out of food. Charles Stanton is snowblind and so weak he is unable to get up. The group continues without him. Charles Stanton dies in the snow. Another storm covers the mountain with a mixture of rain and snow. The guides, the Miwok Indians Lewis and Salvador, become lost. Their suffering is made worse as the rain and snow completely soak their clothing in the freezing weather. Christmas Day in the mountains. Most of the oxen that were to be used for food have disappeared under the snow and lost until spring. Some of the families do nothing. Others boiled ox hides and bones for their dinner. Margaret Reed has planned for this day for weeks and made a special meal for her kids.
She had laid away a few dried apples, some beans, a bit of tripe, and a small piece of bacon. When this hoarded store was brought out, the delight of the little ones knew no bounds. The cooking was watched carefully, and when we sat down to our Christmas dinner, Mother said, "Children, eat slowly, for this one day you can have all you wish." Virginia Reed.
Late on Christmas Day, a blizzard begins to blanket the mountain with fresh snow. Members of the snowshoe party stop and make camp. They discuss the possibility of returning to the lake cabin since they've been without food for 2 full days. Patrick Doolin suggests a type of lottery to see who will die to supply food for the group. It is agreed that they will all continue and wait for the first person to die. They will not have to wait long. The storm increases in intensity and the group has a hard time keeping a fire going for warmth. To add to their ever-growing problems, the hatchet flies off its handle while cutting wood and is lost deep in the snow. Their fire is soon out. Antonio dies from hunger, fatigue, and cold. The group sits under blankets as the snow piles on top of them. Franklin Ward Graves soon dies. The next morning, Patrick Doolin is delirious. He escapes from under the blankets and is exposed to the storm. He returns to the group later and is held under the blankets until he dies. That night, Lamel Murphy is delirious and talks about food. He dies a short time later. The group is too weak to move, and they've been rationing food since early October and have had nothing to eat for 4 entire days. They must eat to survive. They slowly and sadly strip the flesh from their dead companions and eat. No one is able to look at one another. At Alder Creek and at the lake cabins, things are also becoming desperate. Just before the New Year's, Charlie Berger dies at the lake cabins. On January 2nd, James Reed with other immigrants join American forces to fight the Mexicans in the Battle of Santa Clara. The Mexican War is winding down in Northern California and more men are available to help in the rescue attempts of the trapped Donner Party. Reed rallies support and prepares for another attempt to get his family. January 1847. The snowshoe party has exhausted their food. They no longer need their snowshoes and, desperate for food, begin to eat the leather straps from them. Their feet are so badly frozen that they bleed with every step. The idea of killing the Indians for food is discussed. The Indians Lewis and Salvador leave the group and head out into the forest. At the lake cabins and at Alder Creek, families have been living on boiled ox hides, bones, leather items, mice, and the family dogs.
We now had nothing to eat but raw hides, and they were on the roof of the cabin to keep out the snow. When prepared for cooking and boiled, they were simply a pot of glue. We had to kill Little Cash the dog and eat him. We ate his head and feet and hide and everything about him. Virginia Reed.
Margaret Reed and a small group attempt to cross the pass and make it to Sutter Fort. They are desperate, but after a few days in the very deep snow and the freezing weather, all return to the misery at the lake cabins. Jay Fosdick has died on the trail during the night with the snowshoe party. His grieving wife stays with his body throughout the night, hoping to die. In the morning, members of the group craving food strip his body of flesh and prepare it for a meal. Renewed, the group continues. A deranged William Foster talks of killing some of the women in the group for food. He is told that he would be killed if any attempt was made to harm any of them. All thoughts of killing the women end when they find the 2 Indians, Lewis and Salvador. Both Indians are near death from starvation and fatigue. They are both shot. Their flesh is cut from their bodies. For the next few days, the group moves down the mountain until they find an Indian trail and follow it. They have made it. They have survived 30 days in the snow-covered freezing Sierra Mountains. News of the survivors and the hardships in the mountains spread throughout the area. At the lake camp, snow has covered the cabins and most survivors are unable to get up at all. Weak with hunger and unable to get firewood, most lay in dark, cold cabins.
Many times we had on the last thing of cooking and did not know where the next would come from, but there was always some provided. There was 15 in the cabin we was in, and half of us had to lay in bed all the time. There was 10 starved to death. They was hardly able to walk. We lived on little cash a week, and after Mr. Breen with his meat, we would take the bones and boil them 3 or 4 days at a time. Ma went down to the other cabin and got half a hide, carried it in snow up to her waist. It snowed and would cover the cabin all over, so we could not get out for 2 or 3 days. We would have to cut pieces of the logs inside to make fire with. I could hardly eat the hides. Virginia Reed.
Infant Louis Keysburg Jr. and Landrum Murphy have died at the cabins. On January 31st, the first relief party from Sutter Fort heads east into the mountains. Over the next few days, death will become common for the members of the Donner Party still in the mountains. First, Harriet McCutcheon dies. Then Margaret Eddy and her mother Eleanor Eddy. Next, Augusta Spitzer and Milt Elliott. After a struggle up the mountain, the first relief group arrives at the lake cabins and begins to take care of the survivors.
Friday 19th. Froze hard last night. 7 men arrived from California yesterday with some provisions, but left the greater part on the way. Today, clear and warm for this region. Some of the men are gone today to Donner's camp. We'll start back on Monday. Patrick Breen.
At Alder Creek, the group has been searching for their cows and oxen that have been buried in the deep snow. They inform the relief party that they will start eating the dead if they cannot find their lost animals. Infant Catherine Pike dies at the cabins. The next day, the men from the first relief head west with 23 survivors. Unknown to any of them, James Reed is heading for the camps with the second relief group. Already weak with hunger and now unable to continue with the first relief group, the Reed children, Patty and Thomas, are returned to the lake cabins after traveling a short distance. It is heartbreaking and emotional for their mother and siblings. Margaret struggles with leaving her children, not knowing if she'll ever see them again. She knows that they must go on, and the first relief group continues.
We went over a great high mountain, as steep as stair steps in snow up to our knees. Little James walked the whole way over all the mountain in snow up to his waist. He said every step he took he was getting a near paw and something to eat. The bears took the provision the men had cached, and we had but very little to eat. Virginia Reed.
On the third day of traveling, John Denton is unable to continue. He is snowblind and completely exhausted from starvation and fatigue. The group makes him a fire and cuts wood for him, then starts back on their journey. John Denton is never seen alive again. Traveling a short distance, 3-year-old Ada Keysburg dies during the night and is buried in the snow. 4 days into the journey, again they are out of supplies and roast their leather shoestrings for a meal. Later in the day, 2 rescuers reach supplies that they cached on their way up the mountain and return with food. At the lake cabins and at Alder Creek, the supplies left by the first relief group are nearly gone. Some survivors are willing to do anything to survive.
Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. It is distressing. Patrick Breen.
Saturday, February 27th.
When we had traveled 5 days' travel, we met Pa with 13 men going to the cabins. You do not know how glad we was to see him. We had not seen him for 6 months. We thought we would never see him again. He heard we was coming, and he made some sweet cakes. He said he would see Martha and Thomas the next day. Virginia Reed.
The first relief group is nearly out of the mountains and to safety. The supplies are not guarded during the night, and a young William Hook stuffs himself with food. He dies the next morning from overeating. James Reed and the second relief party arrive at the camps. Reed finds his 2 children alive. The joy of finding his kids are overwhelming. The reunion is short, and the second relief party sets out helping the survivors at the cabins and at Alder Creek. Reed witnesses evidence that both camps have been eating their dead to survive. The group presses the survivors to get ready to travel. Reed leaves all the supplies that he can spare for those remaining at the camps. The strongest survivors from both Alder Creek and the lake cabins get ready to go. On March 2nd, the second relief party heads for Sutter's Fort with 17 survivors. They move out the best that they can. A few of the men of the relief party stay to help the remaining survivors at the lake cabins and at Alder Creek. 2 days from the cabins, the snow begins to fall. It's a blizzard, a perfect hurricane as Reed put it, and the last of their food is now gone. The second relief party now sets up camp. James Reed is snowblind and unable to see the fire. The fire is kept going to relieve the freezing cold. The fire pit is slowly sinking into the snow. 5-year-old Isaac Donner dies during the night. After 2 days, the blizzard stops. Reed has his sight back and prepares to move down the mountain. All are weak from cold and starvation. The 7 members of the Breen family, Elizabeth Graves and her 4 children, Mary Donner, and the body of Isaac remain at what will soon be known as Starved Camp. Death continues to take its toll. At Starved Camp, Elizabeth Graves and her young son Franklin die. Toddlers George Foster and James Eddy have died at the lake cabins. Their fathers are coming for them with a third relief party. The men left to care for the survivors in the mountains decide to save themselves. Tamsin Donner offers to pay the men $500 to save her 3 children. Tamsin bundles the little girls for their journey in a tearful goodbye. Charles Caddy and Charles Stone take the 3 little Donner girls to the lake cabins and leave them. They continue over the mountains and pass the survivors at Starved Camp without stopping and head to safety. At Alder Creek, Elizabeth Donner, the wife of Jacob, refuses to leave her little boys and go with the relief party. Her 3-year-old Louis Donner soon dies. His mother is hysterical and soon is taken by starvation. Her 4-year-old boy Samuel suffers a little longer. Tamsin Donner hopes that her little girls have made it and are now safe. At Starved Camp and at the lake cabins, the survivors are forced to eat the dead to survive. At Alder Creek, Nicholas Clark, caring for the Donner families, finds and kills a bear cub near the camp. The bear is cut up and used for food for the group. James Reed and his small group have made it off the mountain and to safety. Patty Reed reaches into her pocket to find a little doll, a lock of her grandmother's hair, and a pin cushion. These are the only possessions that she has from her ordeal in the mountains. The third relief party reaches Starved Camp and witnesses that the group has been eating their dead. Their fire has sunk deep into the snow, making a pit that is 20 feet deep. The group sits in the deep pit, weak and unable to move. One of the rescuers, John Stark, stays with the group at Starved Camp and helps them down the mountain. Eddie and Foster continue to the lake cabins. Nicholas Clark had traveled to the lake cabins for any news of relief and found the 3 Donner girls at the cabins. He returns to Alder Creek, describing the horrors that are unimaginable. Tamsin Donner sets out for the lake cabins to save her girls. On March 13th, Eddie and Foster reach the lake cabins. They find a grisly scene of half-eaten corpses. Their young sons are gone, eaten by those that remain. Tamsin Donner, Nicholas Clark, and John Batiste arrive at the cabins. Eddie and Foster prepare to get moving. Tamsin readies her girls to travel. It is an intensely emotional goodbye. Tamsin Donner refuses to leave her husband George, who is now ill and cannot travel. He is suffering from a severe infection from the injury to his hand repairing his wagon axle months ago. The third relief party heads out for the pass, the men carrying the children. Tamsin Donner returns to Alder Creek to care for her husband. Tamsin and George Donner and the very ill Samuel remain at Alder Creek. Louis Keysburg and Lavina Murphy remain at the lake cabins. Near the end of March, the third relief party and the survivors from Starved Camp were out of the mountains and saved. The nightmare of death continues in the mountains. Samuel Donner, the young son of Jacob and Elizabeth Donner, has died at Alder Creek. Lavina Murphy is dead at the lake cabins. Tamsin is soon alone as her husband dies in her arms at Alder Creek. She starts out in the snow alone, vowing to get to her children. She arrives at the lake cabins, exhausted and wet. Lewis Keseberg sits with her. She is dead the next morning. It begins to snow again, and the fourth relief party is turned back. Lewis Keseberg is alone in the mountains. On April 13th, the fourth relief party heads out for the mountains. The snow is melting and they arrive at the lake cabins on the 17th. The group searches the area around the lake cabins and at Alder Creek for survivors and any items of value. The money found is to be given to the Donner children. They find only Lewis Keseberg alive. The group starts back down the mountain. They follow the trail down the mountain and stop at a campsite used by the other relief parties. Lewis Keseberg spots a piece of cloth sticking out from the melting snow. He pulls on the cloth. The body of his young daughter, Ada, emerges from the snow. The group continues down the mountain. On April 29, 1847, the last survivor of the Donner Party reaches Sutter Fort. The surviving members of the Donner Party will go on to be the early pioneers of California. Some of them will settle in Santa Clara County and San Benito County, and the rest throughout California. The Donner Party is a great American story of tragedy and survival. It has fascinated the public since those events in 1846 and will continue to fascinate future generations.